I remember when it was Ron DeSantis versus Donald Trump in the presidential primary, and Trump made short work of DeSantis. And my one regret was that DeSantis was such an effective governor, and it was because, in my view, he used all the levers he had. If there was a problem, he would do on a state level what Trump's doing now. He would fire people. He would put loyalists in a position. He would remove fund. Like, he was an action-oriented guy who would say, I've got about 20 levers and dials I can operate. How can I use all 20 of them today? Like, that was my favorite thing about Ron DeSantis, the governor, is he used every power and tool and lever of the state, whereas most Republicans never do. They never think of it, or they're too shy, or there's some Marcus of Queensberry rules they don't want. Trump has done that times 100. And there's so many things you said I want to respond to, but I think one of them is how remarkable it is that quite spicy nominees like Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence and RFK Jr., because he's quite radical on some of his views. I like the guy. I love the guy. In fact, I was very touched by his speech the other day. But to get those across the finish line in the Senate, that tells me that Trump isn't just working above the radar. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. I have no idea what. But like you said, to whip the senator, and senators are hard to whip. What do you do to a senator? How are you going to get a senator? They're around for 6 years. Something's going on. And I guess my last point, Ben, would be, because every single day there are huge announcements, the bad guys are on the back foot. By the time they respond to issue number 24, there's issue number 25. And one last thing that Trump did is he went after the ringleaders. He took away Fauci's security detail. He took away security clearance for the 51 or however many people who said Hunter Biden's laptop, or whatever, like all these deep state liars. He banned them. Like he took away Samantha Power's huge slush fund in USAID. So the bad guys are worried about, how do I pay my bills? The bad guys are having privileges taken away. And every single day, Trump starts, as you say, 1,000 front war. He launches 5 more fronts. And he's doing it all so entertainingly in that Trump way. I mean, I don't know if you saw his announcement on plastic straws. He's talking about the sharks munching their way through the ocean. Like, this guy is at his best, and he's almost 80. And I'm a Canadian, as you know, Ben. It's been the best thing to happen to Canada, other than this tariff battle, which we got to figure our way out of. But I think that's on Trudeau's side, not Trump's fault. It's amazing to see. I think the entire world is riveted. And frankly, a lot of the entire world is jealous. I'm jealous of Doge, I'll tell you that right now.
Well, and hopefully it will inspire similar movements throughout the West and around the world. Let me note also that Vice President Vance has said it's going to be the policy of this administration to go at 1 million miles an hour for 4 years. So this isn't going to stop. I don't expect the momentum to stop, although I'm sure that the resistance in the U.S., to the extent it still exists, is going to do everything in its power to try and gum up the works. I think, to your point, it's worth noting with respect to the nominees. First of all, on the one hand, it would really be against norms, so-called, for Republicans to have voted against their own nominees, particularly at the cabinet level.
Right.
And sometimes we forget that, and maybe that's because now everything is on partisan lines, essentially. But obviously, Republicans have voted en masse for Democrat nominees for cabinet positions. Yeah, they certainly did it during Joe Biden.
Right.
So it's a remarkable commentary that it requires a serious whipping operation. But nevertheless, Republicans have often proven intransigent. They haven't known what time it is. That's what I've argued in the past. And I think these nomination fights, where President Trump has ultimately prevailed over the senators, illustrates that they know what time it is, and or they understand that this MAGA movement is as big as Donald Trump, if not bigger than Donald Trump, and that there is a real realignment happening. And basically, they are being responsive to the voters. That's what a democracy is supposed to be. Yeah. And of course, the other side uses the word democracy. What they really mean is oligarchy or ruling elite dominance, tyranny. That's how they define democracy. But because democracy has a veneer of legitimacy, they throw that word around, even though they actually mean something entirely the opposite. I mean, what's more democratic than a president having control over his agencies, who works in them, what the programs are, knowing what each line item looks like, because the American people voted for him to do that. And it would be the opposite of democracy for the agencies to run wild and do whatever they want. Let me just make one last brief point on the nominees. I'll just say RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. RFK Jr. was the scourge of the public health establishment, of big pharma, of everything that prevailed as the draconian COVIDian regime was imposed over the U.S. and eviscerated liberty and justice here and signaled to the rest of the world that it was okay to pursue those policies as well. He was censored by the censorship industrial complex, targeted by the public health establishment, arm of that censorship regime. Now he's the person in charge at HHS. Same goes for Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard is someone who has fought for our country, who's an ardent counter-jihadist. She has heterodox views. She's taken on the foreign policy establishment, the foreign policy blob. She has called out the foreign policy establishment and the deep state for weaponizing their powers against the American people and abusing our civil liberties. Tulsi Gabbard found herself on the TSA's Quiet Skies program, where she was pursued essentially as a high-risk passenger when she flies, as if she was a domestic terrorist. She's been targeted by that regime, and now she's put in the position of overseeing the entirety of the intelligence community and ensuring that it's not politicized and weaponized against the American people. The turnabout here, the turnaround here is remarkable. Those who were targeted by the institutions have now been put atop the institutions, and no one would know better or be more determined to fight, to wring out the rot and corruption, politicization, and weaponization than those who have been targeted by it. That goes for Kash Patel and many others as well. And of course, it starts with Donald Trump, the most targeted man in America.
And it includes Elon Musk as well, who, I mean, we know him as the spaceman and the Tesla man, and now we know him as the Doge waste finder. But let us not forget that he was targeted and his companies were targeted by the Biden administration on everything from the SEC to some coastal commission saying you can't launch more rockets out here. So, you know, the Wall Street Journal the other day called Elon Musk an avenging angel. As in but there's some truth to it, because every person you just said was harassed, and I would say unfairly and perhaps illegally, by the institutions they now run. So I can tell you two things. Number one, they will not be co-opted by them. And number two, they probably learned a thing or two by the lawfare against them, especially RFK Jr., who is a litigator, a public interest litigator himself. It's just incredible to see it. And I saw a stat, maybe you saw it too, Ben, that it was revealed that more than 1/3 of all FBI officers were dispatched to the January 6th insurrection file. Did you see that statistic as well?
I did, and 5,000 FBI officials apparently were involved in January 6 probes.
Wow. And that's an astonishing number. I mean, as you know, Trump has basically invited every single person in the public service to quit, even in the CIA and the FBI. I mean, that is such a huge diversion of a public resource and the integrity and reputational capital of the FBI. I think most Americans still like the FBI. They think of them as the good guys. I think most do. I mean, you would know better than me. But to have it revealed as such a partisan errand boy is astonishing. It's going to be incredible to watch, especially if Kash Patel is confirmed as FBI director. When is that expected?
So he was voted out of committee yesterday. You have to be voted out of committee, out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, along party lines, of course, because that's the way it goes these days. And then unfortunately, there's a little bit of a lag, but it's expected that late next week, he will get his vote on the Senate floor. Fully expect him to be confirmed. And let's note as well, Kash Patel was targeted by this regime himself. Now, if your audience isn't familiar with all the nitty-gritty of this, Kash Patel has held a lot of senior positions across the national security and law enforcement apparatus. He's a federal prosecutor. He was on staff at DOJ. He worked at the National Security Council on counterterrorism. He worked under the acting DNI, Rick Grenell, at the end of last administration. He was the chief of staff, I believe, for the Defense Department last time around as well. But Kash Patel really made a name for himself with the public when he served as a chief investigator for Devin Nunes on the House intelligence community during the Russiagate hoax. And he was largely responsible for unearthing, first, the FISA fraud perpetrated on the FISA court and abuse.
And FISA, that's the foreign intelligence, that's the spy court. That's the secret intelligence court that basically launched the warrants against Trump. Am I right?
Exactly. And Carter Page was sort of the tip of the spear there. And they got these FISA warrant applications to surveil him as a window into the entirety of Trump world. Kash Patel revealed the fraud perpetrated on the FISA court to secure those warrants on him and spy on Trump world. And he exposed much of the other fraud, corruption, and illegality, arguably, from the FBI and DOJ. At the very same time, he was engaging in that investigatory effort, and Devin Nunes himself got savaged by the entirety of the regime, essentially. Patel's own communications were being subpoenaed by the DOJ. They were surveilling his communications dating back to December of 2016, at the very time he was investigating the DOJ and the FBI for their abuses. So he has been targeted relentlessly as well. And now he's being put atop that very FBI you talked about. And the FBI, many of the senior officials there under Christopher Wray, and let's note the FBI, was not only weaponized against J6ers, but also against faithful Catholics, against parents engaged at school board meetings, against pro-lifers. We've seen many of those cases reversed, dropped, arguably clemency or pardons given to those targeted. But we've also seen some of the top FBI officials themselves forced out of the agency. And they themselves, in part, even though the story hasn't been reported, I reported at Real Clear Investigations how several of those individuals weaponized security clearances against whistleblowers within the FBI. Whistleblowers came forward with claims of malfeasance, including around January 6th, around COVIDian policies and beyond at FBI. They had their security clearances suspended. Their lives were wrecked while these investigations went on. And in some instances, you had people who had essentially no closure on their cases for well over 2 years while they were held, suspended security clearances, and unable to work for the FBI and therefore not receiving pay. And there were people who blew the whistle on the fact that these whistleblowers were being targeted internally, and they faced retaliation in the form of their security clearances being pulled too. So it has been reported why some of these very senior officials at the FBI were forced out. You have Democrats here, particularly on the Senate Judiciary Committee, saying that Trump is imperiling national security by pushing out the senior leadership. But the whole point is this is consistent with the Trump administration policy to root out those who weaponize their powers and not only subvert our liberties, but also, to your point, at great opportunity cost to the actual threats facing us when you target Americans like we're domestic terrorists or enemies. Kash Patel has been a champion of those whistleblowers. He's been targeted himself. And that's why it's another vital appointee that we have, nominee that we have. And I do expect him to be confirmed next week.